Hey guys, it's your boy, Ballface8020, back again with another great commentary. One thing that I've been interested in for a while is this idea of sorry about that noise in the background, is this idea of markers, or what I'll call them timestamps for decades, of when you really start to see one time begin and another time end. And you'll see what I'm talking about as we get into the video. So these timestamps, as I'm calling them, most of them I wasn't around for, and some of the ones that I was around for I don't really remember. But this is like my best trying to start when the different decades started and ended from an American perspective. Now, obviously, we're going to start it with the 40s, the 1940s. So I would say that the 1940s began, this is all from a U.S. perspective, with the U.S. entry into World War II. So at the very end of 1941. I'd say that's when the 40s start. And then you got to think, when do the 50s begin? And that's a tough one. That's a tough one because you'd think about something like, the way I look at it is, I'm trying to think of post-World War II pop culture stuff. One thing that really comes to mind is Miracle on 34th Street, which I actually saw the original when I was a kid. And then, and I was thinking about it, I was like, that's 1948. It was released in 1948, so I guess it was probably made in 1947. And I don't feel like there's a 50s vibe from that. I still feel like it's a very 40s thing. So I still think we're still in the 40s there. So it's got to be sometime after Miracle on 34th Street. And I would say that the marker that I'm going to do to the start of the 50s is the 1952 Moondog Coronation Ball, which is regarded as the first rock concert in American history. So you could say that Elvis started it. His first single came out in 1953. I would just say when you had, like I said, the Moondog Coronation Ball is a good, I think most people probably didn't even know what was happening or was going on, but I'm just trying to, I don't think that's necessarily as important. I'm just trying to think of a landmark. And I didn't know that this is whereas I think that it's pretty clear that when I think the 40s in America began with the U.S. entry into World War II. I think that's kind of hard to argue with. You're not going to find any other really good things for that. But for the 50s, it's a little bit vaguer. You could start it with the release of Elvis's first single. You could start it with A Miracle on 34th Street. I still think that movie is way too 40, so that's pushing it. So I would say actually you really couldn't do that. But you could start with Elvis's one. That would be a good one, Elvis's first single. But like I said, the 50s, what could be more 50s than, classic rock and roll? And, without the Moondog Coronation Ball and this rock music that had been building up, you would have had no Elvis. So, I admit that I'm not too satisfied with that one, but it's the best I can do. So I'm saying the 50s started in 1952 with the Moondog Coronation Ball. The 60s. When did the 60s begin? So the thing is, the 40s are the 40s, whatever. The 50s are kind of that, sort of mythical, idyllic decade. That's the real decade of the American dream. The nuclear family and the suburban house where the dad works at a factory or some other job, and that's enough to get 2 cars and have the wife stay at home with the kids. The wholesome black and white TV. I think Leave It to Beaver's in the 50s. I'm not positive about that though. So, the 50s had their own thing. And then the 60s is this rebellion against that. Because in a lot of ways, the 50s were the golden time. In a lot of ways, the 50s were the best time in American history. I know that some people, especially people from a more left-wing background, like to really beat on the 50s. But for a lot of people, things in the 50s were great. I think the 50s were a great time. And again, in a way, it was the best time in American history. However, those people who were complaining about it and bashed the 50s as being repressive and stuff, those complaints don't come from nowhere. There was always that, as good as things may have seemed on the surface in the 50s, there was tension building up. And for for racial stuff, gender stuff, not really economically, things were pretty good in the 50s. And then foreign policy, and just culturally, the thing is, but whatever, like the 50s, there were the 60s can really be seen more than anything else as a rebellion against the 50s. 60s were probably the most transformative decade in American history. And I remember, I was a huge, I'm a boxing fan, not as passionate as I used to be. But my dad didn't know much about boxing, but he loved Muhammad Ali. And so I was reading about boxing, and it was the first time I didn't know anything about Muhammad Ali, and I'd seen all the, so I saw for the first time all the anti-white stuff he said in the 60s. And I went to my dad and I was like, "Did you know he said all this shit? Like this is really bad. Why do you admire this guy so much?" And my dad was like, "Well, if you don't, the 60s were their own thing. If you weren't there, you don't know what it was like. So it's like anything anybody said in the 60s, even if you don't like it, they get a pass for." So yeah, the 60s really are a very transformative time. So I mark the 60s as beginning with the assassination of Kennedy in 1963. And another thing my dad had told me when I was young was that my dad was born in, I guess, 1955. And he said before the Vietnam War got big, and so everybody in America people trusted the government. And then after Vietnam, that trust was just shattered. And, Kennedy, I guess, we had already been in Vietnam by the time Kennedy got assassinated, but the war didn't pick up until 2 or 3 years later. In Lyndon Johnson's second term. So yeah, I think that, I've marked that as the beginning of the 60s. Is the Kennedy assassination. And then I had the 60s ending and the 70s beginning in the 1971 DC anti-war protest, which I think is the largest protest in U.S. history. My mom was actually there. and the anti-Vietnam protest. Now, at first, I was thinking to have the 60s end with Woodstock or even Altamont. But I decided against it mainly because there was still that 60s energy. I think that, Woodstock could very well be seen as the climax of the 60s, and Altamont was where it was clear that this was ending. This was needed to be dialed back. It was time for a change. Things were going too far. But that energy was still there. And like you said, that that 1971 DC anti-war protest, that is a very 60s energy. And so I would say that that the 60s didn't end till then, and that end of the 60s is the beginning of the 70s. And then if you think about the stuff, what proceeds to happen, right after that anti-war protest, you would have the re-election of Nixon. I can't remember what Nixon. I think. Trying to remember if Nixon went off the gold standard in 71 or 72. I don't know. But anyway, I think actually it was 71. I think it was right after the anti-war protest, like a month after the anti-war protest, Nixon went off the gold standard. But anyway, Nixon gets reelected in 1972. That's a very 70s thing, even though I know his first election was in the late 60s. But you can say his second term of Nixon. The second term is, where he's going to get impeached with Watergate, is very 70s. Paris Peace Accords, which again, I don't see, that's not a 60s thing. That's a very 70s thing. Of course, we're well into the 70s by this time. The Yom Kippur War. So, yeah, I would say that, like, the 1971 DC anti-war protest is a good marker of the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s of the new era. Now, the 1980s, this is not a very original one. This is, and I've thought about this one. I really think the best timestamp you're going to have for the beginning of the 1980s is the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, or at the end of 1980. Because there's nobody who embodies the 1980s more than Reagan. I mean, the whole idea of Reaganism defined the 1980s. Now, I was born in the 1980s, the early 1980s. And first thing I want to say is I have memories of the 1980s, like clear, vivid memories, but I have no memory of Ronald Reagan ever being president. I mean, I have memories of a time where Ronald Reagan was president, but I have no memories of him being president. And another thing about the 80s, I have no memory, again, lots of memories of the 80s. I have no memory of the 80s of knowing it was the 80s. I don't have any memory of that. The first memory I have in relation to a year is when it became 1990. That's the first time I ever remember being aware of what year it was. And so even though I guess I'm technically an 80s kid, I was born in the early 80s and my early years were in the 80s. I have a lot of memories from the 80s. I've always seen myself as a 90s kid, because the 90s is when I came of age. The 90s to me were my true formative years. But looking back on it, I would have to say Ronald Reagan's election as the beginning of the 1980s. I'm sure you could think of some other things, but to me, that's going to be what embodies the 80s, or the beginning of the 80s the most, and the end of the 70s. And you do see right after, because the 70s was defined by lots of inflation, like in America, like very high inflation. And then the 80s, Reagan gets in, and also just this, what Jimmy Carter called malaise. Like America just seemed like it was falling apart and it was declining. And then, which Reagan, and I'm not saying Reagan was or wasn't responsible for any of this, but there was this kind of renewal. Like even Reagan's phrase was, "It's morning in America." This is like that. This is renewal. This is renewal. Like the U.S. like had lost in the Vietnam War, and the country was just really not in a great place. There was, like I said, that inflation, and then Reagan, you get this change of pace, this optimism, this real renewed belief in American greatness and in capitalism. And, the country starts to get over Vietnam, and then, takes it to the Soviets and places like Afghanistan and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, that's in a lot of ways you could see the, like I was saying, in a lot of ways you could say the 50s were the best time in American history, but it's hard for me not to think that the 80s weren't the best time in American history. Again, there was, economically, things were a lot worse in the 80s than they were in the 50s, but in a lot of ways, things were better. Like I said, I don't ever have any memory of it being the 80s, but I have memories of the 80s, as a kid in the 80s, and it was a really special time. When you go back and you watch stuff like, especially something like The Breakfast Club. That was, a great movie, very much of the 80s. And, yeah. So then when do the 90s begin? And this is the one that I think is pretty definitive. In fact, it was this one is what made me want to do the video, because you're rarely going to see something as definitive of this. I would say it was the release of the music video of Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit. Now, I don't like Nirvana. and I never liked that song. But if you go back and watch that video, and I'll admit I didn't see it at the time because my cheap ass parents wouldn't buy cable, so I wouldn't have seen it. But like in hindsight, at least, and maybe even at the time too, if I had been paying attention, or didn't have cheap parents who wouldn't buy cable, that was like a truly, like, it was a revolutionary watershed, whatever you want to call it, because the 80s had a very specific aesthetic. And, in the 80s, through the late 80s, you had these like hair bands or glam rock, Poison, Rat, some other ones. And these were really popular bands. They were huge. And then you have Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, and it's like just like a cultural musical revolt against that aesthetic. And I guess it's like, so instead of, so the grunge is the scene that Nirvana was from, and it's what their sound came to be called. Instead of like the sort of like energetic and optimistic and ostentatious sound of like glam metal and hair bands and stuff, you have Nirvana, which is very Gen X, very cynical, like like a very cynical and cold and just like over it attitude. And it really, nothing had been released like that before. It was at least not widespread. I guess that grunge scene had been developing in Seattle since at least the late 80s. But Nirvana in that particular video really symbolized it. And then what you'd see is that these hair bands, which were the biggest thing in the country, during the late 80s, pretty much overnight become a joke. When like Nirvana releases this video, all of a sudden they're a joke. They're just gone. And it's a really dramatic transformation. And if you listen to some, like the hair bands just got wiped out with with Nirvana and stuff. But you also, you really see, a dramatic change in pop music, because it's like some like very 80s bands like Duran Duran and Heart. Like Heart had their last big hit is they at least had like, These Dreams, or like Go On When I Close My Eyes, whatever it's called. That was 1990 or even 1991, I'm not sure. That song by the Sundays, Summertime, 1990. And then Duran Duran's, I think their last mainstream hit, if you don't count that River Grande song that came back later, was in 1993 with Come Undone. So you still had a little bit of that 80s thing going on in the early 90s, but really there was like a pretty dramatic transformation, and I would really say it was with Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit that Gen X came into its own. And when I was a kid in the early 90s, there was so much talk about Gen X. Like, it was just like Gen X, Gen X, Gen X. And you want to go see like the most Gen X movie ever, go watch Killing Zoe. And like I said, Gen X had like that early 90s aesthetic and very, I don't know, just 90s energy. Nothing embodied it. Nothing embodies it better than that 1991 Smells Like Teen Spirit video. So when do the 90s end? Now, this is a tough one, because I want to say the 90s ended with the 9/11 attacks in 2001. And you could certainly make the case for that. However, the thing that you kind of have to remember about the change of the 90s is that, okay, in the early 90s, there was essentially no internet. Like, you saw, like, AOL came on the scene in, like, 1993 or 1994. I remember in the early 90s, we had this thing in my 4th grade class. I'm trying to think of, let's see if I'll... Yeah, so this would have been, I don't know, sometime in the early 90s. We had this thing in my 4th grade class where we were in one of my 4th grade classes where we were sending like emails, right? We didn't even call them emails at the time. I can't remember what they were called. Primitive emails to some other 4th grade class. I think in a different part of the country. I'm not sure if it was in a different country altogether. I don't remember. But like I said, there was like, and then you just like, I think that year or the year after that, my family finally got a computer. That's the thing. Is like us, an upper middle class family, did not have a computer, any computer at all. I'm not saying not to just hook it up to the internet, just have a computer until the until the early 90s. And but so then sometime then we got like, so then AOL came out. But there was like, so that was like the beginning of the internet. I know the internet technically started in like 1985 or something, but I'm talking about like widespread adoption of the internet. But this early internet, as far as I know, didn't have websites. And it took, if you like, just going to like any page took forever. Like to download it took like, 30 minutes or like over an hour sometimes if you wanted to download something. So the main thing that you used the internet for was these AOL chat rooms. I'm talking about in like the early mid-ish 90s when we got the internet. And on top of that, you had to pay per time that you were using it. You had to pay by the minute. There was no such thing as unlimited internet. And so like basically like, for us, like as kids, when we had the internet, we were like said like, okay, you can like, my parents would be like, you can use it for like half an hour a week to like go on a chat room and stuff because they don't want to pay for that. And, my parents were cheap, but they weren't being unreasonable with this one. And I know my dad made some pen pals online before he got bored and got off of it. Yeah, so the thing is, but the point where I'm going with this is that the internet was not a big part of the culture in most of the 90s. And like I think it was I don't remember like what year this was, but I do remember noticing a point where there was, in fact, I would be able to go out and find it because it was the same year that there was an episode of The Simpsons where Bart gets caught shoplifting. And I remember at the end of that episode, there's this thing with, he's playing this game called like Lee Carvello's Putting Challenge. And my brother on our computer, that using that like Lee Carvello Putting Challenge inspired him to make this like slideshow on our computer of parodying like the internet, like the primitive internet. So this would have been like 95 or 96, because this is when you first started seeing, the reason my brother would have even thought to do that was because 95, 96 is when you started hearing stuff like on the radio or on TV, people mentioning their websites. In fact, I believe like the oldest still functioning website, or one of the oldest still functioning websites, is the website for the 1996 film Space Jam. So like that's like the beginning. So like even then, like you see it showing up in like 95, 96, but it's not a big deal. It's really considered this sort of like cultural annex, a weird kind of stupid thing. And the internet is it's mainly seen as something kind of like for nerds. It's not a big part of culture. It's this thing for nerds from like, yes, it becomes big. It started becoming bigger in the mid 90s, but it's not like culturally big. It's like it's just like I said, it's this thing for nerds that seems like it's like I remember thinking in the mid 90s when I heard them talking about it, I was like, why are they trying to make this happen? It's not going to work. We had no concept in the mid 90s that like newspapers were going to go extinct or stuff like that. You start to see it bigger. I remember during the Clinton impeachment, my dad, was really like that was like when the internet was kind of becoming really big and stuff. And, my dad trying to find stuff on like the primitivedrudgereport.com about it. But my dad really hated Clinton. And so anyway, but I guess so anyway, we're getting back to my point. Why not make 2001 and the World Trade Center attack the end of the 90s? Because I think the 90s had ended before that. I think that by the time of the World Trade Center attacks, the 9/11 attacks, the internet had become a big enough part of culture and use, and I had certainly developed a internet addiction at least 2 years, prior to the 9/11 attacks. Trying to think, would have been 9/11 to so the next 2000. Yeah, I would say that by 2000, I had developed a pretty serious internet addiction, and I was using the internet a lot by the late 90s. So I think that the real 90s, because the 90s was a time of like good humor and optimism, and few things really symbolize the 90s culturally as well as Seinfeld. Like Seinfeld, you could say The Simpsons too, but Seinfeld was something that everybody watched. And when I remember it was in middle school, when the night that the day that the last episode of Seinfeld was going to be airing that night, and our science teacher assigned us homework that night, and like there was like this uproar in the class, like, you can't assign us homework tonight, it's the last episode of Seinfeld, like it was some kind of holiday, like this was like just like this national the holiday, because it was something that like it's probably the last thing that the whole country watched, if you're not counting something like the Super Bowl. And so you could say like shows like Friends and Seinfeld really kind of like had that 90s good humor energy. And the end of Seinfeld really proved to be, really was the ending of an era, and like the beginning of I know that I talked about Nirvana being more cynical, but Nirvana was like a more cynical style of aesthetic and music, but it was also still in the background. There was that still like an overall optimistic energy, even like throughout the 90s, that really started to go away. After like in the aughts. The aughts was and proved to be a much more pessimistic time. And I would say the 90s were more cynical, and then the aughts are more pessimistic. The 90s are cynical but not pessimistic, and the aughts are, pessimistic but maybe not so cynical. So that's what I would say that it was. And then this is going to be cliche. When do the 10s start? I thought about this one, and again, I'm sorry how cliche it is. The election of Obama. That really was a milestone. It was a really big event, and like for those of you who weren't around, the Democrats prior to, politics was so much different back then. Because I know like Trump has come around and stuff like that, but like. Really, it was like pre-Obama, the Democrats were much different than the Democrats today. I don't really know how else to say. Because they've always been Democrats, they've always been the left, so that's always been that always comes first. And but the Dems were. First of all, the one thing you have to remember about like the pre-Obama Democrats is that the party was overtly white. I know that like the leadership of the Dems now is heavily white too, but it was definitely seen like it wasn't something anybody even thought about. The Republicans were always chastised as the racist and stuff, But the Dems weren't seen as diverse either. Like, they had some black people in it, but not in positions of influence. It was generally, like, seen as like the influential people, the heavy hitters are all white. And it wasn't like a big, I don't want to make it seem like it was a big deal, but it was definitely thought of that way. And there was this time in the aughts where the Supreme Court, not the Supreme Court, like the circuit, the crazy circuit out in California, I guess it's the Ninth Circuit, had made some ruling like you weren't allowed to say God bless America or something. I don't know. It's just the Ninth Circuit being weird. And there were all these Congress people who then went out, Democrats and Republicans both. It was mixed, Democrats and Republicans, who got up on the steps of one of the Capitol buildings and were saying, God bless America. It was really corny, really stupid, really cheesy. But you had to do that. Like I'm saying, the Democrats were doing that. Can you imagine today's Democrat Party doing something like that? And because it was like, that was just kind of, how it was. Like, it was like, there was like a certain amount of, I don't even know what to call it, that the Dems had back then. And, as late as I think 2000, the New York Times published an op-ed saying that it was time for the U.S. to crack down on illegal immigration. In 2004, John Kerry, who was the Democrat nominee, in his debate against George Bush, attacked George Bush for not being hard enough on border security. Okay? And then in 2006, when the Democrats won they had these massive wins in the midterms, they had, one of the things they ran on was the need to secure the border, securing the border and stuff. And then in Hillary's primary against Obama in 2000, I guess that would have been in 2000. Wait, no, that was in 2008. In 2008, there was the primary became kind of like a racial thing. And there was even a part in the primary where Hillary said, like, I know that there's, hardworking, like something about like hardworking white people who aren't having their voices heard. And so Hillary, but like, again, can you imagine any Democrat saying something like that now in a primary? I mean, even in a general election, they wouldn't say that, but let alone in a primary. And so, yeah, I mean, it was the party really changed. And then so when Obama won the nomination, and then he didn't just win the nomination, but then went on to just win a crushing victory in the general election. I think he won by 7 points or something. He flipped states like Indiana. Just a huge victory. And, Bushism and Republicanism had just been so discredited. And there was this idea that, like, I think it was Donna Brazile, who had been Al Gore's campaign manager, but she was an Obama supporter. And she was talking about, like, like some of like the bitter hags who had left the Democratic Party over Hillary not being her coronation being disrupted. And, excuse me. She said, we don't need them. She said, we don't need them anymore. We don't, we don't need those working class whites or, things like that. We've got voters of color and young voters and stuff like that. And then this would continue until Trump's election, and maybe even after that. There was this idea, somebody, I can say somebody who followed politics, this idea of, they called it the ascending coalition. That demography is destiny, and that America is going into this liberal, multiracial future. And you would say, I think it was Matthew Yglesias, douchebag, would go on to call something, this was from a later time, that he would say, he calls it the Great Awakening. And like, where you see that this kind of like, that's when woke really becomes a big thing, is with Obama. And that goes on for that, for the next, decade or whatever it is. And I would say that same energy lasted until our current decade now, which you might think was like, okay, Trump's election. No, not Trump's election in 2016. In Trump's first term, there was very much fighting against the cultural wave. Like the Trump, had won the election in 2016, albeit closely and controversially. But, politics is downstream from culture. And the culture was still with that Obama-esque energy, that Obama-like woke energy. Now, I'm not saying that the public ever really totally bought into that. That's not really the point. But the culture did. Culturally, it was still there. And I would say that energy didn't really start to end until January 6th of 2021. The riot at the Capitol in 2021. And shortly after that, Biden got inaugurated, and it was Biden's term that really you started to preside over the end of that Obama energy from 2008 all the way through 2021, the big wokeism and stuff. And going back to what I said about politics being downstream from culture, when Trump was running this time and for the 2024 election, this time he had the cultural winds at his back. The public was sick of it. Like, the thing is, as late as the Trump's 2020 re-election campaign, Trump had to get up there and, at his inauguration, did a thing where he was swearing in naturalized immigrants at their ceremony because he had to show that he was pro-immigration or something. Can you imagine Trump or any Republican doing something like that now? No, because there's no longer this need to cater to those sensitivities anymore. I remember people were afraid, people who I knew voted for Trump were afraid to publicly say that they supported building a wall, as all through Trump's first term. And now it's just kind of I don't know what the public opinion is now, but it's just it wouldn't be a big deal to say about it. So completely different energy now. Yeah. So anyway, those are my timestamps. That's all for now. See you in the next.